You must understand, my friends, that the psyche does not move randomly through time. It moves in waves, in symbolic seasons, and the unconscious itself marks certain years with a kind of archetypal intensity. I have often said that humanity does not merely live history. We are lived by forces far older than our individual lives. And as I look at the silent currents unfolding beneath your personal suffering, I see that the year you call 2026 carries the unmistakable vibration of an inner turning, a psychic solstice for the ones I call empaths, those whose nervous systems are woven from threads of ancient attunement, whose eyes read the emotional world before the intellect can interfere. These are the people who carry the imprint of the mother, not merely the personal mother, but the archetypal mother whose shadow has shaped civilizations and whose wound has bound entire family lines into patterns of sacrifice, silence, and emotional servitude. If you are here, listening, it is because your life has already begun to whisper that the path behind you has ended. You sense that the year arriving before you is not simply another passage of time, but a threshold. And thresholds, as you know, are dangerous places. They dissolve the old identity. They call forth what is dormant. They awaken what has slept too long beneath the polite masks you learned to wear in order to survive the emotional storms of childhood. Many of you have been shaped not by nurture, but by emotional hunger. You became caretakers for the wounds of the mother you were trying to love, yet never quite reached. You absorbed her fear, her fragmentation, her emotional instability. When she cried, you learned to silence your own pain. When she withdrew, you learned to chase love. When she broke, you became the glue holding a system together that should never have rested on a child's shoulders. This, my friends, is the origin of the empath's wound. And because nature abhors a vacuum, you later attracted those who resembled the emotional absence of your earliest bond. The narcissist appears not as a random tormentor, but as a psychic mirror, reflecting the unresolved archetype of the mother. It is not the narcissist's cruelty that binds you. It is the familiarity. It is the echo of an old wound, still pulsing like a forgotten dream inside your chest. Every empath who has been entangled in the cycle with the narcissist believes, at first, that they have chosen poorly, but I tell you, you did not choose. You were chosen by the unconscious to revisit the wound you thought you had outgrown, the lover who drained you, the friend who used you, the employer who exploited your sensitivity. Each was a messenger wearing the mask of the mother's shadow, summoning you to confront the original fracture. But 2026 brings something different. It brings pressure, it brings clarity, it brings the collapse of the illusions that once kept you compliant. There is a moment in every psychological transformation when the old persona can no longer contain the emerging self. For empaths, this moment arrives when they finally refuse to mother those who refuse to grow. It is when the body collapses under the exhaustion of carrying emotional burdens not theirs to hold. It is when the spirit refuses to bend again. Your unconscious is preparing you for such a moment. Perhaps you have already felt its tremors, the rising anger that surprises you, the sudden intolerance for manipulation, the quiet recognition that you are done apologizing for your own sensitivity. These are not flaws, they are signals. They are the psyche preparing for liberation. In the dreams of many who come to me, I see the same symbol emerging, a great river that once flowed backward, now turning in its rightful direction, carrying the dreamer toward a distant light. This reversal symbolizes the empath's awakening, the moment when energy, once given outward, compulsively begins to return inward. The unconscious does not speak with human language. It speaks with movement, with images, with the shifting of instinct. And when the river within you turns, nothing in your external relationships can remain the same. The narcissist who once held power over your heart begins to lose their grip, not because they changed, but because you did. Your psychic river is no longer flowing into their emptiness. You have withdrawn the energy that sustained the dynamic, and the mother wound, that deep ache for belonging and recognition, begins at last to crack open, exposing its buried truth. You were never meant to heal your mother by sacrificing your own life. Healing the mother wound does not mean confronting her. It does not mean blaming her. It means seeing clearly the archetype she embodied, the forces that shaped her before she ever shaped you, the multi-generational inheritance of unlived lives and unmet needs. Empaths are often the carriers of this unconscious lineage, the ones chosen by the family system to bring awareness to what has been ignored for decades, sometimes centuries. This is why your sensitivity is not a curse but a form of psychic intelligence. It allows you to perceive what others cannot bear to see. But sensitivity without boundaries becomes martyrdom, and martyrdom is the shadow side of the empathetic soul. I speak to you now from the quiet stone of my tower by the lake, where the walls themselves have absorbed the stories of countless seekers. I tell you this: the awakening approaching in 2026 is not gentle. It is not patient. It does not wait for your readiness. The unconscious does not negotiate. When it decides that a pattern must end, it will dismantle the life that protects the pattern. Many of you will experience relationships dissolving, friendships fading, old identities falling away like leaves stripped by winter winds. Do not fear this dissolution. Transformation always begins with decay. The seed must split before the root can emerge. Likewise, the empath must break the internal pattern of mothering others before they can mother the abandoned child within themselves. I have seen this awakening in those who sit before me, their eyes suddenly clearing, their posture shifting, their breath deepening as if they have finally remembered something ancient and profound. When asked what changed, they often say, "I simply reached a point where I could not continue the old way." This is how the unconscious speaks, through thresholds of exhaustion, through moments of unbearable clarity, through dreams that disturb the surface of your waking life. And 2026 is the year that delivers this threshold collectively for empaths. It is as if the archetype itself is rising from the depths, calling forth those who have suffered long enough to finally reclaim their authority. You must understand that the narcissist is not simply a person, it is an archetype as well, the archetype of the false self. Inflated, brittle, devouring. When an empath meets a narcissist, it is the collision of two archetypal energies, the overdeveloped capacity to feel and the underdeveloped capacity to feel. One absorbs too much, the other absorbs nothing. This dynamic binds them like a sacred but destructive dance. But the moment the empath breaks the mother wound, the dance ends, the archetypal contract dissolves, the narcissist loses their psychic supply, and the empath returns to the path of individuation, the dangerous and beautiful path of becoming one's own self. I recall a dream shared by a patient many years ago. In the dream, she stood before an enormous door carved from the roots of an ancient tree. The door pulsed with a heartbeat. When she placed her hand upon it, the door opened not outward but inward, revealing a vast darkness she feared to enter, but a voice whispered, "To reclaim your life, you must descend first." This dream represents the initiation awaiting the empath in 2026. You cannot transcend the mother wound until you descend into the shadow it created. And in the shadow, you will find not only pain but power, the instincts you suppressed to remain lovable, the voice you silenced to keep the peace, the boundaries you dissolved to maintain attachment. These are your lost treasures. They await your return. The awakening will feel like a rupture, but ruptures create openings. You may feel anger rising like a forgotten flame. You may feel grief pouring out unexpectedly. Grief not only for what was done to you, but for what you did to yourself in order to survive. You may feel a strange compassion for the child you once were, the child who carried everyone else's emotional weight without ever being carried herself. This compassion is the beginning of inner reparenting, the restoration of the archetypal mother within your own psyche, not the wounded mother, but the great mother, the one who nurtures without asking you to disappear. As this awakening unfolds, a powerful psychological truth emerges. Empaths are not weak. They only appear weak when their energy is trapped in the archetype of the wounded child. Once they break the mother wound, they become formidable. Their intuition sharpens, their presence deepens, their boundaries become sacred. They are no longer drawn to those who drain them, but to those who resonate with their emerging strength. This shift is not subtle, it is seismic. And the narcissist, sensing the loss of control, often attempts a final grasp, but there is nothing left to hold. For the empath who awakens does not return to the old dynamic. 2026 marks the crossing of this internal threshold. It is the year when the unconscious demands that the empath stop abandoning themselves. It is the year when the mother archetype reveals both its wound and its medicine. It is the year when the cycle of chasing emotionally unavailable figures begins to crumble under the weight of new awareness. And as you step through this passage, you will begin to feel something unfamiliar but unmistakably yours. The pulse of the self rising, steady and inexorable, calling you into a new life shaped not by trauma but by truth. The transformation has already begun. As we move deeper into this exploration of the empath's awakening, I ask you to listen not only with the mind, but with the subtle interior that has always known what the intellect tries to suppress. There is a moment in every psychological life when what has been tolerated for decades suddenly becomes intolerable. It happens not through force, but through illumination. A single inner light reveals the cost of a lifetime of emotional servitude. This illumination is what 2026 symbolizes, the year when consciousness pierces the veil that has kept empaths loyal to the very patterns that injure them. For the empath, the mother wound is not merely a memory of childhood. It is a living psychic field. It exists in the body, in the breath, in the posture of shrinking when someone raises their voice, in the reflex to soothe someone else's discomfort even when your own pain is screaming. It exists in the temptation to fix what is breaking in another person while ignoring what has been breaking in oneself. And because the original wound is pre-verbal formed before language, before reasoning, it expresses itself as a compulsion rather than a choice. Many of you wonder why you keep falling into relationships where you give too much and receive too little, but the truth is that the wound seeks its own repetition. The psyche tries to heal by recreating the conditions of the original injury, believing unconsciously that this time, perhaps, the outcome will be different. But 2026 brings with it a new psychological demand to recognize that repetition is not healing, it is imprisonment. Healing begins not when the external pattern breaks, but when the internal identification with the wounded child dissolves. You cannot save your mother by saving partners who resemble her. You cannot resolve your childhood by reenacting it in adulthood. And you cannot transform the narcissist by pouring your empathy into their emptiness. The narcissist is not a child you failed to mother properly. They are the externalized symbol of your own unclaimed shadow, the part of you that has been starved of power, voice, and instinct. The unconscious has its own seasons, and there is a season when a person is asked to turn inward, to retrieve fragments of the self long buried under the rubble of relational survival. For empaths, 2026 is such a season. It is a descent, not into despair, but into clarity. It is a return to the inner basement where the abandoned aspects of your psyche wait like trembling animals, hoping you will finally come for them. These are the instincts you were taught to suppress, the anger you were forbidden to express, the sovereignty you were conditioned to relinquish. They have lived in the dark corners of your psyche, misunderstood and feared, yet they are your protectors. Without them, empathy becomes a vulnerability rather than a strength. I want to tell you a story, drawn from the dreams of a woman who came to me many years ago. In her dream, she stood in a vast hall filled with mirrors, but each mirror showed a different version of herself. In one, she was a child crying. In another, she was a young woman smiling while secretly holding her breath. In a third, she was older, exhausted, carrying a heavy bowl of water that spilled with every step. Yet in the final mirror, she saw herself standing tall, unburdened, with a fire burning slowly in her chest. She approached this mirror, and the version of herself inside whispered, "I am who you were always meant to become." And this dream is the psychic blueprint of the empath's awakening. You have lived too long identifying with the earlier mirrors, the wounded child, the compliant daughter, the emotional caretaker, the silent sufferer, but the final mirror waits for you. It is the self. It is the archetype of wholeness. It is the inner figure that emerges only after the empath breaks the mother wound and refuses to shrink any further. But let me tell you something essential. Breaking the mother wound does not mean abandoning your mother. It means abandoning the illusion that your worth comes from meeting everyone else's needs. It means withdrawing your psychic energy from the archetype that demanded your sacrifice. And as you pull this energy back into yourself, you will feel a strange combination of grief and relief. Like a bird realizing the cage door has been open for years, but only now daring to fly. 2026 amplifies this realization because it brings pressure on the structures in your life that were built on emotional overextension. The relationships you maintain by self-abandonment will begin to crack. The friendships held together by your one-sided nurturing will drift. The environments where you minimized yourself will no longer feel tolerable. This is not failure. This is liberation. The unconscious removes what no longer aligns with the emerging self. Some of you may feel fear at this threshold. Fear is natural. The psyche fears its own expansion just as the body fears the moment before birth. But fear is not a sign to retreat. It is a sign that the old identity is dissolving in the chambers of the unconscious. Fear often appears as a guardian standing before the next stage of development. The task is not to fight the guardian, but to understand what it protects. Often it protects the child within you who still believes that choosing herself will lead to abandonment. This belief was once true. As a child, you did depend on attachment for survival, but you are not that child anymore. The task of adulthood is to retrieve the inner child and bring her into your present, where she no longer must sacrifice herself to be loved. I once received a letter from a former patient describing a sudden shift in her life. She wrote, "Something inside me broke, but it wasn't me, it was the spell." That is precisely what happens when an empath sees the mother wound clearly for the first time. The spell breaks, the enchantment of trauma dissolves, and in that dissolution, the narcissist loses their psychic power, because the narcissist thrives not on your love, but on your unhealed longing. Once that longing begins to heal, their influence fades like a shadow at sunrise. The psyche, like nature, moves instinctively toward balance. Empaths often believe that their caring nature is something noble and purely good. But every archetype has a shadow. The shadow of empathy is self-erasure. The mother wound teaches you to prioritize others' feelings above your own. It teaches you that love must be earned. It teaches you that your needs are burdens. And so when the narcissist appears, demanding your emotional labor, it feels familiar, it feels like home. But familiarity is not destiny. Awareness breaks the pattern. You must understand the depths of what is unfolding inside you. This awakening is not a psychological trend. It is not a temporary emotional shift. It is the restructuring of the inner architecture of your life. When an empath heals the mother wound, they stop playing the role of the good child. They stop offering unconditional compassion to those who weaponize it. They stop rescuing people from their own consequences. They stop apologizing for emotions that are natural, and perhaps most importantly, they stop attracting relationships where they must dim their light to stay safe. In 2026, the unconscious invites and perhaps demands a reunion with your instinctual power. You will feel this power not as aggression but as presence. You will speak more slowly, more deliberately. You will stop over-explaining. You will begin to feel a quiet fire rising in your chest, not burning you, but illuminating the path ahead. You will sense your boundaries not as walls but as sacred thresholds, and others will feel this shift even before you say a word. The narcissist, especially, will sense it. They always sense when their influence is waning. There is another dream I wish to share with you. This time from a man who spent decades losing himself in relationships until he reached a breaking point. In his dream, he walked through a dense forest at night, guided only by a dim lantern. Each time he tried to leave the forest, he found himself turned around. But then he reached a clearing where a gigantic tree stood, its roots glowing faintly. He approached the tree, and from within its trunk emerged a child, frightened, small, trembling. The child took his hand and whispered, "Do not leave me again." When he woke, he understood that the lost child was not a memory. It was a living part of him, calling him home. This is the work of 2026, to stop leaving yourself. The empath's healing begins when they recognize that the love they have been pouring outward must be redirected inward, not selfishly, but necessarily. The psyche requires equilibrium, the self requires recognition, and sensitivity, when grounded in strength, becomes an extraordinary form of intelligence. You begin to sense who is safe and who is not. You begin to discern between compassion and compulsion. You begin to choose relationships rather than being chosen by your wounds. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, the version of yourself that stands on the other side of this awakening. See yourself not as the child seeking approval, nor as the caretaker holding broken people together, nor as the partner bending to hold the emotional weight of another adult. See yourself instead as someone who listens deeply to their own intuition, whose boundaries are informed by wisdom rather than fear, whose presence is calm but powerful, and whose empathy is no longer a sacrifice but a gift offered only to those who honor it. The path to that version of yourself begins with a single decision: the decision to stop betraying your own soul, The awakening of 2026 is not a prophecy of chaos, but of alignment. It is the moment when your inner world and outer world collide, revealing the contradictions you can no longer ignore. And as those contradictions become intolerable, you will be compelled to choose authenticity over attachment, truth over comfort, and self-respect over self-sacrifice. And when you choose this, the mother wound begins to heal. The narcissist cycle begins to crumble. And the empath you once were, the one shaped by trauma, begins to dissolve, giving rise to a new figure emerging from the depths of your psyche. A figure who embodies strength, clarity, and sacred autonomy. This is the empath who awakens in 2026. There comes a moment in the inner life when the soul begins to resist what it once tolerated. This resistance is not defiance, but the birth of sovereignty. For empaths, sovereignty is the lost inheritance, the aspect of being that was sacrificed early in life to secure belonging. When a child grows up in an environment where the mother is emotionally inconsistent, overwhelmed, wounded, or unavailable, the child quickly learns that survival depends on attunement. They become experts at reading the room, predicting emotional storms, anticipating needs that were never their responsibility. And in that process, something precious is displaced: the right to exist as oneself. To heal this displacement is to undergo a profound metamorphosis. The empath must reclaim the energy that was unconsciously pledged to the archetype of the wounded mother. This reclamation often begins in confusion. You feel restless, you feel a pressure rising from within, urging you to stop suppressing what has been silenced for decades, but you do not yet know what to do with this rising force. It is like waking from a dream and realizing the dream world has not fully released you. This liminal space is where transformation brews, and 2026, in its symbolic configuration, amplifies this liminality into a collective psychic threshold. You may begin to notice that the emotional labor you once offered so effortlessly now feels heavy, even unbearable. People who once relied on your capacity to soothe, support, and absorb their pain will seem suddenly distant or demanding. Conversations that formerly felt familiar might start to feel intrusive. Your body may react before your mind does, tightening, shrinking, withdrawing, or flaring with heat. These are the somatic expressions of your unconscious beginning to defend its own boundaries. For the empath, the body is often the first messenger of truth. The mother wound lives in the body. It lives in the tight throat that never learned to speak its needs. It lives in the solar plexus that curls under the weight of constant responsibility. It lives in the heart that beats with compassion for everyone but itself. As awareness rises, these areas begin to awaken, as if remembering their original purpose: to protect you, not to sacrifice you. Dreams during this time may become vivid, almost prophetic. You may dream of houses with rooms you have never seen, symbolizing the unexplored aspects of your psyche. You may dream of drowning or being submerged in water, the ancient symbol of the unconscious calling you to dive into what you have avoided. You may dream of animals, especially wounded or caged ones, reflecting the instinctual self-longing to be liberated from its old restraints. These dreams are not random. They are messages from the deeper strata of your being, urging you toward wholeness. One patient once described a dream in which she was climbing a mountain carrying a child on her back. The child whispered constantly that she must hurry, must not stop, must keep sacrificing herself. As she climbed, she grew weaker, yet the child grew heavier. Finally, near the summit, she collapsed, unable to move. At that moment, the mountain cracked open, and an older version of herself emerged from the rock, radiating quiet strength. The older self lifted the child from her back and said, "You are free now." When she told me this dream, she wept. For years she had lived with the belief that her worth was measured by how much she could carry. But the dream revealed the truth. She was carrying the past, not the present. She was carrying an internal child who demanded sacrifice because that was the only language she knew. This is the essence of the empath's awakening, the recognition that the demands pulling you backward are not coming from the present, but from the wound. When that recognition crystallizes, the narcissist loses their psychic power over you. They depended not on your love, but on your unconscious need to heal the unhealed mother. When that need dissolves, their influence collapses like a shadow deprived of light. 2026 catalyzes this dissolution by intensifying your inner clarity. Many empaths will find that they can no longer endure relationships where they must disappear to maintain harmony. They will feel an instinctive pull toward emotional honesty, even if that honesty threatens the stability of long-standing dynamics. This honesty is not aggression, it is alignment. For the first time, the empath begins to speak from the self rather than the wounded child, and the voice of the self is unmistakable, steady, grounded, quietly powerful. As you reclaim your voice, something remarkable happens. Your perception sharpens. You begin to see manipulation you once rationalized, emotional exploitation you once dismissed, avoidance patterns you once tolerated. The mother wound had blurred your perception by convincing you that love requires endurance, silence, and unconditional giving. But healed perception reveals a different truth. Love that demands the erosion of your being is not love, but attachment to trauma. I recall a dream from a man who had spent most of his life entangled with narcissistic partners. In his dream, he walked through a corridor of broken mirrors, each reflecting distorted versions of him, one too small, one too large, one twisted into grotesque shapes. At the end of the corridor stood a single mirror, pristine and untouched. When he looked into it, he saw not his face, but a vast, still lake surrounded by dense forest. The lake was undisturbed, its surface like glass. When he leaned closer, a ripple formed, and from the depths rose a figure made of light, The figure looked at him with familiarity, as if recognizing him after long absence. It whispered, "Come home." When he awoke, he said he felt something shift, as if the endless search for love outside himself had ended. This dream illustrates the turning point for the empath, the recognition that the self, not a partner, not a parent, not a rescuer, is the true center of the psyche. The narcissist cycle ends not when the narcissist changes, but when the empath returns to themselves. And when this return begins, the psyche reorganizes. You may feel periods of disorientation, as if old emotions are surfacing without explanation. You may oscillate between grief and empowerment, between fatigue and exhilaration. This oscillation is natural. It is the psyche recalibrating itself after years of imbalance. The individual who emerges from this recalibration is not the same as the one who began the journey. The empath who heals the mother wound becomes rooted. Their empathy is no longer porous. It is discerning. Their compassion is no longer compulsive. It is intentional. Their intuition is no longer clouded by longing. It is crystalline. They are no longer drawn to people who need saving, but to people who can stand beside them as equals. This shift alters every aspect of their relational life. The empath becomes difficult to manipulate, difficult to drain, difficult to destabilize, not because they become hardened, but because they become whole. And this wholeness radiates in subtle but powerful ways. Your posture changes, your energy changes, the pace of your speech changes. You no longer rush, you no longer chase, you no longer explain yourself endlessly to those committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer remain in conversations that deplete you. Instead, you cultivate silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of sovereignty. This silence is your new language. It speaks louder than words ever could. I want you to imagine now the empath as a figure entering a vast symbolic landscape. They stand at the edge of a forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp soil. Behind them lies the old path, the familiar terrain of self-abandonment and emotional labor. Ahead lies the unknown, an expanse shrouded in mist. The empath hesitates, looking back one last time, not with longing but with clarity. They understand that the old path cannot take them any further. The air around them shifts, as if the forest itself is breathing wisdom, and in that breath a whisper emerges. Step forward, oath. This whisper is the call of the self. The mist before them begins to part, revealing a faint golden light. As they step toward it, the forest rearranges. Paths that were invisible become visible. Obstacles dissolve. Shadows transform into guides. This is not fantasy. It is the symbolic blueprint of individuation. When the empath stops running from their own inner world, the world reveals itself as an ally rather than an adversary. 2026, in this symbolic landscape, is the moment the mist parts. The year itself acts as a threshold that the psyche can no longer postpone. The empath enters a phase where the unconscious accelerates their evolution. You will notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, appearing with uncanny frequency. You might think of someone and they call, you might dream of a serpent, only to encounter its symbolism the next day in a book or conversation. These are not trivial occurrences. Synchronicity is the language of the self making contact with consciousness. It signals that you are aligned with an inner destiny long denied. I've often observed that when a person stands at the brink of deep transformation, life itself seems to rearrange around them. People leave, opportunities emerge, old identities crumble, new aspects of the personality reveal themselves. This dismantling is not chaos, it is purification. The psyche is clearing space for the person you are becoming. And for the empath, this new person is not a stranger. They are the one you were always meant to grow into, the one who existed beneath the surface of your wounds. As this emergence unfolds, you may feel moments of profound aloneness, not loneliness, but aloneness, the realization that healing requires standing apart from the patterns that once defined you. Aloneness is the crucible of individuation. It is where the self speaks most clearly. It is where the empath learns to feel without absorbing, to love without losing themselves, to see without becoming blind to their own needs. And then something extraordinary happens. The wound becomes wisdom. The same sensitivity that once made you vulnerable becomes your compass. The same pain that once trapped you becomes your teacher. The same intuition that once warned you of danger becomes the quiet force guiding you toward alignment. The empath, in their restored state, becomes a rare kind of human being, one who feels deeply yet stands firmly, who loves fully yet wisely, who sees clearly yet compassionately. This is the empath that 2026 calls forth from within you. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when the psyche realizes it no longer belongs to the past. This moment is not loud. It does not announce itself with triumph or drama. It arrives quietly, like dawn spreading across the surface of a still lake. And yet, when it arrives, everything changes. For the empath, 2026 is the year this moment begins to radiate through every layer of the inner life, dissolving the illusions that once shaped their identity and revealing the truth that has been waiting beneath the wound. As you approach this threshold, you may feel a strange mixture of grief and expansion. The grief arises because you are finally releasing a version of yourself that was constructed around survival, the child who sacrificed their needs to maintain harmony, the adolescent who learned to read subtle emotional signals as if her life depended on it, the adult who became the emotional container for others without ever being held in return. These identities were not failures, they were strategies. They were the psyche's attempt to navigate a world that demanded too much from a soul that felt too deeply. But strategies, no matter how noble, are not destinies. When the awakening begins, the strategies must fall away. This falling away can feel like a death. In psychological terms, it is indeed a death, the death of the persona, the mask you wore to survive the emotional landscape of your upbringing. The persona is not malicious. It formed because the child believed their true self was too much, too sensitive, too intuitive, too alive. But as you deepen into your own awakening, you begin to see that what you believed was too much was simply the self waiting patiently beneath the surface. And when the self begins to rise, it does so with a force that no external relationship can restrain. I have observed in many patients that the rise of the self often coincides with a profound shift in relational patterns. People whom you once depended on for validation begin to feel distant, not because they changed, but because the unconscious contract between you is dissolving. The narcissist, who once fed on your sensitivity, feels suddenly powerless. They may attempt to reclaim your attention, invoking guilt, confusion, or nostalgia. But the empath who is awakening cannot be pulled back through the old door. The mother wound is unraveling. The cycle is breaking. The psyche is refusing to return to structures that demanded its diminishment. In the symbolic landscape of the dream world, this shift often appears as the image of crossing water. Water symbolizes the unconscious, and crossing it represents the transition from one psychological state to another. One woman shared a dream in which she rowed a small boat across a vast black lake. She was terrified, yet she continued. Halfway across, she looked back and saw the shore dissolving behind her as if it had never existed. When she reached the opposite shore, she stepped onto solid ground that glowed with a faint golden light. She felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as if she had returned to a place she had known before she was born. This dream, like so many, reveals the deeper truth. Awakening is not about moving forward. It is about returning to the self. The empath who heals the mother wound discovers something extraordinary: the capacity to hold their own emotional world without collapsing into the emotional worlds of others. This capacity is not coldness, it is maturity. It is the integration of instinct, intuition, and intellect. It is the union of the inner masculine and feminine, the logos and the eros, the direction and the feeling. When these forces unite, the empath becomes psychologically whole, able to navigate relationships without losing themselves and able to love without sacrificing their soul. This wholeness creates boundaries that are not rigid but living. They respond to the moment with fluid intelligence. A healed empath does not give endlessly, they give consciously. They do not stay in relationships that diminish them. They withdraw with dignity. They do not absorb the pain of others as a moral duty. They recognize that every person must confront their own shadow. And when necessary, they allow others to feel the consequences of their actions, something the wounded empath never dared to do. When this transformation begins, your life may reorganize itself with startling speed. Opportunities may appear where there was once stagnation. People who resonate with your new frequency may enter your life suddenly, as if summoned by an invisible thread. You may discover talents, passions, and instincts that were dormant beneath years of emotional survival. The psyche, once relieved of the burden of managing others' wounds, redirects its energy into creation. This creative energy is the hallmark of individuation. It signals that the self is taking its rightful place at the center of your life. I want to describe a symbolic image that has appeared repeatedly in the dreams of empaths awakening from the mother wound. A door that only opens from the inside. The dreamer often stands before this door, puzzled, pushing on it, pounding it, pleading for it to open, but nothing happens. Only when the dreamer places their hand gently on the wood does the door glow warmly, revealing a handle on the inside. When they pull the handle toward themselves, the door opens easily, revealing a landscape filled with light. This is the symbol of inner authority. You cannot be freed from the outside. You must free yourself. The narcissist cycle ends the moment you realize that the door was never locked. As you step into this new landscape, you may experience a sensation that feels almost foreign. Spaciousness, the nervous system, once tightened by years of hypervigilance, begins to loosen. The mind becomes quieter. The emotional body becomes more attuned, not to external demands, but to internal truth. You begin to ask questions you were once too afraid to ask. What do I want? What do I feel? What do I need? And the answers, at first faint, begin to rise from within like ripples across still water. The empath who heals becomes a different kind of human being, one who is led not by fear but by inner resonance. They are no longer seduced by intensity mistaken for love. They are no longer loyal to chaos disguised as passion. They are no longer devoted to relationships that feed on their capacity to feel deeply. Instead, they become aligned with relationships that honor depth, reciprocity, and soul. And it is here, at this point in the transformation, that the empath discovers something profound. The mother they were seeking in others was the inner mother they had not yet learned to embody. When the inner mother awakens the archetype of nurturance, protection, and wisdom, the external search ends. The psyche stops seeking approval from wounded figures. The heart stops chasing bonds that echo childhood pain. The body stops tolerating environments that drain its vitality. And the soul begins to feel, for the first time, what safety truly is. Safety does not come from attachment, it comes from alignment. In this alignment, the empath finds that their sensitivity becomes a source of strength rather than vulnerability. Intuition sharpens into discernment, compassion matures into healthy emotional distance. Empathy integrates with instinct, forming a balanced psychological field where the self governs rather than the wound. This is the empath's evolution. This is the true breaking of the mother wound. And so, as 2026 unfolds, the empath stands on the edge of a new existence, not defined by childhood, not shaped by narcissistic cycles, not bound by generational expectations, but guided by the voice within the voice that was drowned out for years by the noise of survival. Imagine this final scene with me. You stand in the center of a vast circular stone chamber. A single flame burns before you, illuminating the carved images of archetypes etched into the walls: the mother, the shadow, the child, the self. As you approach the flame, it does not burn hotter, it grows gentler, expanding into a warm sphere of light that surrounds you. And within this light, a figure emerges, not a deity, not a mythic creature, but yourself. Not the self shaped by the past, but the self shaped by truth. The self you have been walking toward across many lifetimes of feeling too much and receiving too little. This self looks at you with recognition, not judgment, and with a voice that feels like both memory and prophecy. It says the words you have been longing to hear. You are no longer the child of your wound. You are the keeper of your light. Have to. This is the culmination of the empath's awakening. The mother wound dissolves not because the past disappears, but because you finally step into a future that honors the fullness of who you are. And the narcissist cycle ends as all illusions end in the presence of truth. The path ahead is no longer one of survival. It is one of creation, clarity, depth, and profound inner authority. You are not rising into a new identity. You are returning to the one that has always been waiting beneath the surface. 2026 does not awaken you. It reveals that you have already awakened